And welcome once again to another Bible Story Children's Time. So happy you could join us today. It is Wednesday, and glad to see you. So today we're going to start out our Bible Story Children's Time by talking a little bit about festivals that were integral to or important to Jewish culture at the time of Jesus. So in the first century AD, what we called AD. There were three festivals, three holidays that were central to the Jewish faith and the Jewish culture. And those were days or holidays when every observant Jew who was at all possible, at all capable of making the journey to Jerusalem was expected to go there so that they could celebrate these holidays. And the three holidays, in Hebrew, they are called the Shalosh Regalim, and I know I'm not pronouncing that right. But the three major holidays or major festivals were Pesach, which is Passover. And we learned about Passover a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about Moses and the freeing of the slaves or the Jewish people from Egypt. So there's Pesach or Passover. There's Shavuot, which is first fruits, and that is celebrated 7 weeks after Passover. And that's the holiday, also because it's 7 weeks after Passover, that's the holiday that's called Pentecost. Of course, it's a very important Christian holiday, but to the Jewish culture, it meant something entirely different. And then the third festival or holiday is called Sukkot. Sukkot. And that translates to Festival of Booths, Booths, temporary structures like tents. And that gets its name from the temporary structures that people used to live in when they were out gathering the harvest in. So the festival of Shavuot, or what we know as Pentecost, that was a celebration of the end of the grain harvest, barley and wheat, in Israel of the time. And the festival of Sukkot, or Booths, was a celebration of the end of the time of harvesting fruit. So these were two critical times in the life of the Jewish people. And of course, Passover was like the most critical because that defined who they are or who they were and how they came to be liberated from Egypt. So on each of these three holidays, as I said, any Jewish person who was observant, who was living faithfully, was expected to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem so that they could make a sacrifice to God in thanksgiving for each of these festivals. And Jerusalem, the home of the great temple, the temple was the only place where these sacrifices could be made. And this had been like this for about roughly 1,000 years at the time of Jesus. So this was a long established requirement and tradition. And it was a big deal. Jerusalem at that time, depending on who you read and whose figures you accept, Jerusalem at that time had a population of somewhere between 80,000 and 600,000. Now, I know you're thinking, wow, that's a pretty big range. 80,000 is a contemporary estimate based on the size of the city and how the housing is configured and just kind of a logistical look at the city, thinking how many people could live in this space. 600,000 is based on writers of the time who reported on population. So you kind of pays your money and you take your chances on who you believe. In any case, it was a large population. And I mentioned that because at the time of Passover, for instance, the population would double because of all the pilgrims, all the men and women and families coming to town to celebrate Passover. So you can imagine, people doubled up in houses, sleeping, and people probably sleeping out in the olive groves around the city. Markets overrun with people needing to buy things. So it's a big, confusing mess. Just think of the most crowded circumstances you can imagine today. And you're probably pretty close to what it was like. And that's important because the Bible story we're going to look at today comes from the book of Luke, or the Gospel of Luke. And it is the second chapter, and it's verses 41 to 52. And it takes place at Passover. When Jesus was when Jesus was 12 years old, according to Luke, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. Now, from Galilee, from Nazareth to Jerusalem, it's a journey of several days at least. And it goes through some territory that's not always the best, safest territory. So they would have traveled with a group of people. Probably a group of family, extended family. Well, it could just be neighbors and friends too. But they traveled in a group from Nazareth to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And Passover was like a week-long festival. It wasn't just the night before and the day of. It was an extended period of time when they would be celebrating. They would be feasting. They would be going to temple. They'd be doing all sorts of things that would make the holiday special. So after Passover was over and it was time to return to Nazareth, Joseph and Mary, packed everything up and they started home. Because they were traveling in a group, they assumed, and you know what assuming does, but they assumed that Jesus was traveling with others in the group. Other friends that he had, other people that he knew. They just knew that they had all basically started out at the same time. And they assumed that Jesus had started out with them, when in fact, Jesus had stayed behind in Jerusalem. They didn't discover that he was missing until they had been on the road for a day. Now, if you are old enough to be a parent, you can imagine what it felt like at the end of the day. Let's say it was dinner time. Joseph and Mary said, hey, Joseph maybe said to Mary, you should really get the boy over here so we can have dinner. And Mary says, okay, go get him. And Joseph says, where? Where is he? And they start checking with all their friends. They start checking with their relatives, Hey, Cousin Mo, Is Jesus over there? No. Cousin Curly, is he over? No, not there. So they check all throughout the whole extended group that they're traveling with, and they discover Jesus isn't there. Their firstborn son, their 12-year-old son, grew up, has grown up, is growing up in the simple little town of Nazareth, has been left alone in a jam-packed, crowded, insanely crowded Jerusalem. This is sort of like, Home Alone 2, Home Alone New York. Because they realize that their boy, their son, oh gosh, Son of God, entrusted to their care, is now in the care of strangers. And you can imagine what they're thinking. So they hurry back to Jerusalem. Remember, it was a day's journey to get where they were, where they discovered he was missing. So it was probably the better part of a day to get back. And you can imagine the panic that was going on in their minds. If you're married or familiar with adults, you can maybe imagine the discussions that were going on. The "I thought you were watching him," "No, I thought you were watching him" type of discussions, which are not helpful. And you can imagine that as they got closer and closer to the city and closer to finding out what had happened, potentially finding out something pretty horrific. It goes anywhere from just losing him and you never see him again to something really bad happened. And they're in full-blown panic mode. And they go back and they retrace their steps. Okay, we stayed here. Let's go back. Maybe he went back there. So they go back and ask. No, haven't seen him. Okay, well, he was really interested in this market, this store here. Let's go here and ask if they've seen him. And they go and they describe, and the shopkeeper says, no, haven't seen him. And this just goes on and on and on. 3 days. 3 days. No trace. And by now they are undoubtedly imagining the worst possible outcome. So at the end of their rope, worried beyond description, they go to temple. Probably to pray. Pray for a miracle. Pray for help. Pray for something. They go to the temple. They find in the courts there the big paved yard where people congregated. Over in one corner, sitting with a bunch of elders, they hear Jesus' voice. And they immediately, cut their way through the crowd. There's still a crowd. They cut their way through the crowd. They get to this knot of people gathered around somebody they can't see. And they push their way forward and they look and, oh my gosh, there's Jesus. Little 12-year-old Jesus sitting on the steps talking to these elders. They're not just talking to him. They're not just explaining things to him. He is responding to them. He's asking questions. He's carrying on an intellectual conversation with these elders in the temple. I remember once when my brother, I remember being told about this. I wasn't even around yet. When my brother was very young, 3 or 4 years old, he went missing for a while. Not for a terribly long time, but it was long enough that my grandmother, who was in charge of watching him, I had time to also imagine the worst. And she was just calling the police when a neighbor brought him back and explained that he had been riding his bike following a garbage truck. Fascinated by garbage trucks. And I remember my grandmother saying, I didn't know whether to hug him or strangle him. And you have to think that same kind of conflicting emotion is going through Joseph and Mary, because they are just so glad to see Jesus alive and unharmed and just fine. And on the other hand, they maybe want to strangle him because of all the worry that he put them through. And they start immediately talking to him, and Joseph and Mary are going, Mary, Luke says, dude, what were you thinking? You had us worried sick. And Jesus just kind of looks at her and he blinks and he says, what? Why have you been looking for me like that? Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? Meaning the temple. And Mom looked at him and just went, never mind. Come along. So they all went back to Nazareth. I was going to say it's one big happy family, but probably not, at least for a while. Luke tells us, though, that his mother treasured all of these things in her heart. Treasured the idea that her son had been found safe, and no doubt treasured the idea that her precocious child had been talking to the elders of the temple like an equal. And besides just being a relatable human story, there's a couple of other things that we can take away from this. The first is that it's Luke reminding us again who Jesus was. Because the moment where Jesus says, didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? That's like Luke turning to the reader, giving him the elbow and say, okay, hear what he said? Father's house. So what does that make him? Okay, that's one thing. The other thing that's interesting, and quite honestly, I didn't really think about it until today when I was reading this over, is there's that 3-day period before they find him. And when they do find him, he's exactly where he's supposed to be. So that 3 days is reminiscent to me of the 3 days from crucifixion to resurrection. So it's kind of foreshadowing what was going to happen. So that is the story of how Jesus went missing for a few days when he was a kid. And that is the only story we have from the time of Jesus' childhood. But it's a doozy. And it's one that anybody who's ever had a child missing, even for a little while, can relate to. And it's also a great reminder of who Jesus is and what he was about. So, that's the story for today. We will be back tomorrow, 5 o'clock. Have a great rest of the day and stay healthy.